Imagine that you've just come back from a branding workshop. You're excited. You've got a shiny new PDF labeled brand guideline sitting on your desktop. Inside, your Pantone colors, your approved fonts, maybe a logo usage guide with those little diagrams showing clear space requirements and angles and shapes. And you're thinking, great, we've got our brand sorted. Except you don't. Because somewhere between that branding meeting and reality, something got lost. And it's costing you in confused customers, missed opportunities, and frankly, a lot of wasted effort. Here's what I keep seeing in middle management, and honestly, sometimes even at higher levels. Someone latches onto this idea that brand equals visual identity. That if you just use the right shade of blue and stick to the approved typeface, you're on brand. And then some customer service team answers the phone with zero personality. The sales deck contradicts the website's messaging. The social media feels nothing like the email campaigns, and everyone's confused because, hey, we're using the brand colors, right? This is one of the most misunderstood principles in business, and the misunderstanding is expensive. So let's talk about what our brand is specific colors and fonts, it's our look and feel actually means, and more importantly, what it doesn't mean. Because the gap between those two things, that's where businesses go to die. Section 1, what this actually means. First, let's be clear, visual identity matters a lot. When someone says, I'm thinking of those golden arches, you know what they're talking about, McDonald's. When you see that swoosh without the name, you know it's Nike. Tiffany's shade of blue is so recognizable, they trademarked it. Visual consistency creates recognition. It builds trust. When someone sees your logo, your colors, your typography used consistently across touch points, their brain files it away. I know this company, I've seen them before. And here's where the brand guideline has truth. Your visual identity is the most immediate, visceral way people experience your brand. It's what they see first. It's what registers before they even read a single word. Thinking about walking into a store? Before anyone greets you, before you see a price tag, you're already forming impressions based on lighting, color, layout, materials. Visual language is powerful because it communicates instantly. So when someone creates brand guidelines around your colors, fonts, logo usage, it's not wrong. That's actually essential foundational work. You need that consistency. But here's the critical part most people miss. Visual identity isn't your brand. It's the expression of your brand. Section 2, the fundamental misunderstanding. This is where everything goes sideways. I've watched companies spend 6 months and 6 figures developing a visual identity system. Beautiful work, custom typography, carefully chosen color palettes based on color psychology, the works. And then they hand it to their team and say, here's our brand, use these colors and fonts. And the team thinks, got it. As long as I use Helvetica and stay within the approved color palette, I'm doing branding right. No, you're doing visual consistency right. Those are not the same thing. Here's a test. Imagine you're designing 2 presentations, one for a funeral home and one for a children's birthday party company. You use the exact same colors and fonts for both. Does that work? Of course not, because brand is about so much more than visual elements. Brand is how you make people feel. It's your values, your positioning, your voice, your personality. It's the promise you make and whether you keep it. It's every interaction someone has with your company, from the way customer service answers the phone, to how your product is packaged, to what your CEO says on LinkedIn. The visual identity? That's just the costume the brand wears. It should reflect the brand's personality, but it isn't the personality itself. And this is where middle management gets stuck. Someone goes to a conference, comes back energized about brand consistency, and suddenly they're the brand police, making sure everyone uses the right hex code while completely missing that the customer experience is inconsistent, that the messaging is muddled, that nobody can articulate what the company actually stands for. Section 3, real-world consequences. Let me give you a real example. Gap, the clothing retailer, spent years building brand recognition around their classic blue box logo with white serif typography. Then, in 2010, they decided to rebrand. New logo, different font, more modern. They kept the name, they kept their stores, they kept their products, but they changed the visual identity. The response was immediate and brutal. Customers hated it. Social media exploded. And here's the interesting part. People said it didn't feel like the Gap. Gap pulled the new logo after 6 days, just 6 days. Now, the lesson here isn't never change your visual identity. The lesson is that Gap's visual identity had become deeply connected to what people understood their brand to be. Classic, American, reliable, accessible. when they changed the visual identity without changing the underlying brand, or rather, when the new visual identity didn't match what the brand actually was, people rejected it instantly. But here's the flip side. Apple has changed their logo multiple times. The rainbow apple, the monochrome apple, the glossy 3D apple, the flat apple, different variations over decades. Why didn't customers revolt? Because the visual changes reflected genuine evolution in what Apple was as a brand. They moved from countercultural underdogs to premium lifestyle brand, and the visual identity evolved to match. The changes were in the service of the brand, not in place of it. Another example, Airbnb. In 2014, they completely reimagined their visual identity. New logo, new colors, new typography. And they didn't just show up one day and say, "Hey, we're using this symbol now." They explained it. They told a story. The new logo, which they called the B-Lo, representing belonging. It could be a person, a location, a heart, an A. The visual change was wrapped in brand meaning. People didn't just accept it, many loved it because Airbnb understood that changing visual identity without connecting it to a brand purpose and values is just decoration. Section 4, what actually makes a brand. So if visual identity isn't the brand, what is? Let's start with brand strategy. This is your positioning, how you're different from your competitors, what space you own in the customer's mind. It's your target audience and what they value. It's your unique value proposition. For example, Volvo's brand strategy centers on safety. That's their position. Everything they do reinforces that. Their visual identity happens to be clean and Swedish and minimalist, but that's in service of the safety message, not in place of it. Then there's brand values. What does your company stand for? Patagonia stands for environmental responsibility. That's not a visual choice, that's a core value that influences everything from their supply chain to their marketing to their visual design choices. Brand voice and tone. How do you sound when you communicate? MailChimp is friendly and approachable with a touch of humor. That comes through in their writing, their interface design, their support interactions. Yes, their visual identity supports that, but you could change the colors and the fonts, and MailChimp would still sound like MailChimp. Brand experience. What's it like to interact with your company? Zappos built their brand on customer service. The colors and fonts they used were almost irrelevant compared to the fact that they'd overnight you your shoes and let you return them for an entire year, and their support team would stay on the phone with you for hours. Amazon's brand is about convenience and selection. Sure, they have visual consistency, but their brand is really about one-click ordering, fast shipping, easy returns, having everything. That's experience, not aesthetics. And here's the thing, your brand exists whether you design it or not. If you don't intentionally shape your brand strategy, values, voice, and experience, the customers will form their own impression anyway. And it might not be what you want. The visual identity should be the deliberate expression of all these deeper elements. It's the translation of the strategy and values into something people can see. When you get that backwards, when you design the visuals first and expect them to create the brand, you end up with what I call a logo with nothing behind it. Section 5, how to apply this correctly. So how do you actually use visual identity as part of your brand, not instead of it? You start with the internal work. Before you design anything, answer these questions. What do we stand for? Who are we? Who are we for? What makes us different? What's our personality? What experience do we want to create? This isn't fluffy stuff. This is strategic foundation. Nike knew they were about athletic excellence and inspiration before they ever designed the swoosh. Once you have that clarity on brand strategy, values, positioning, and voice, then your visual identity becomes the outward expression of all those things. Your color palette should reflect your brand personality. Are you trustworthy and stable? Maybe blue makes sense. Are you energetic and bold? Maybe you need something more vibrant. But you're not choosing blue because blue looks nice. You're choosing blue because it communicates something true about your brand. Typography does the same thing. Serif fonts tend to feel more traditional, established, trustworthy. Sans serif fonts feel more modern, clean, accessible. Script fonts feel more personal, elegant, or creative. But again, these aren't arbitrary aesthetic choices. They're strategic ones that should align with your brand. And here's the critical discipline. Once you establish visual identity, you need brand guidelines that go way beyond the visual. Yes, document your colors and fonts and logo usage, but also document your voice and tone, your messaging framework, your values and how they show up in decisions, your customer experience principles. REI, the outdoor retailer, has visual guidelines, but they also have brand guidelines that talk about their co-op model, their commitment to the outdoors, their activism around public lands. The visual stuff serves the bigger picture. When someone on your team is creating something, a presentation, a social media post, a product description, they shouldn't just ask, am I using the right colors? They should ask, does this feel like our brand? Does this align with our values? Does this sound like us? Does this serve our customers the way we've promised? Section 6, Common Misapplications. Let me walk you through the ways this gets misapplied because I see these patterns constantly. Mistake 1, the visual-only rebrand. A company decides they need to refresh the brand, so they hire a designer to update the logo and pick new colors. They roll it out, nothing else changes, and they're surprised when customers don't respond differently. That's not rebranding, that's redecorating. If your brand wasn't strong before, new fonts won't fix it. Mistake 2, the brand police approach. Someone becomes the guardian of the style guide, and their entire job becomes enforcing visual consistency. You can't use that shade of green, it's not approved. The font is wrong. Meanwhile, the sales team is making promises the product team can't keep. Customer service sounds nothing like the marketing. The website says one thing, the sales team says another, but hey, at least everyone's using Helvetica. Visual consistency without strategic consistency is just neat. Mistake number 3, the template trap. Companies create beautiful templates for everything. PowerPoint templates, email templates, social media templates. Everyone uses them religiously, and everything starts to look the same. Not in a consistent brand way, in a soulless, generic way. Because templates are tools, not substitutes for thinking. Your brand should feel consistent, but it also needs to breathe and adapt to context. Imagine if every Nike ad was exactly the same format, the same layout, same structure, just different photos. That would be boring. Nike's brand is consistent, but their expression of it is dynamic. Mistake number 4, ignoring sub-brands and product lines. Maybe your company has multiple products or services or sub-brands or wholly owned subsidiaries. Maybe you have different audience segments. And then some novice marketing expert decides everything must look identical because brand consistency. But sometimes strategic differentiation makes sense. Google has a consistent visual system, but Gmail looks different from Google Maps and it looks different from Google Ads. They're all recognizably Google, but they're tailored to different contexts and audiences. The rule isn't everything must be visually identical. The rule is everything must feel like it comes from the same brand family. Section 7, Exceptions and Limitations. Now let's talk about when visual identity does really matter tremendously and when the emphasis on it is actually correct. In crowded, commodified markets, visual identity can be a primary differentiator. If you're selling water or vodka or tea, products where functional differences are minimal, packaging and visual identity might be the main thing that sets you apart. Liquid Death is just water, but their visual identity, edgy, punk, rock, skull imagery, completely differentiates them. For them, the visual identity is doing much heavier lifting than for, say, a business-to-business software company where the brand is really about trust, expertise, and results. Similarly, in retail and consumer goods, visual identity connects directly to the purchasing decision. Someone walks down an aisle and they see a dozen options that are basically the same product, and your visual identity needs to jump out and communicate something compelling in 2 seconds. In these cases, yes, the colors, the fonts, the packaging design, the logo, these aren't just expression of the brand, they're business-critical brand assets. But even here, the visual identity still needs to connect to something deeper. Liquid Death's punk aesthetic isn't random. It's expressing a brand personality that appeals to people who think normal water brands are boring. And early-stage companies sometimes need to prioritize visual identity more than established ones. When you're new, you don't have reputation or track records. Your visual identity is doing a lot of the work to establish credibility and make a first impression. A startup with an amateur-looking logo and inconsistent visual identity will struggle to be taken seriously, even if their actual product or service is great. First impressions do matter. But as you mature, the deeper brand elements become more important. Apple could probably change their logo and survive because their brand is so strong. A startup? They couldn't. And here's a limitation nobody talks about. Visual identity can't fix a broken brand. If your product is bad, if your service is terrible, if you treat customers poorly, new colors and fonts won't save you. I've seen companies try to rebrand their way out of reputation problems. It doesn't work. Ask Facebook, now Meta. The name and visual identity changed, the brand problems didn't. Visual identity is brand communication. It can't communicate something that's not true. Section 8, when to emphasize what. So when should you focus on visual identity and when should you focus on deeper brand elements? Focus on visual identity when you're establishing brand recognition, new companies entering new markets, or when you've been visually inconsistent and need to tighten it up a little bit. In these situations, the guideline, our brand is our look and feel, has more weight. Focus on visual identity when you're in a visually driven category like fashion, design, hospitality, consumer goods. These industries live and die on aesthetics and first impressions. But focus on deeper brand elements like strategy, values, voice, and experience when you're trying to differentiate in a commodified market, when you're building long-term customer relationships, or when trust and reputation are your primary assets. Professional health services, healthcare, financial services like banks or credit unions, B2B companies. For these, visual identity matters, but it's supporting infrastructure. The real brand work is in the expertise, reliability, customer experience, and the trust. The best approach? Don't choose, integrate them. Your visual identity should be a thoughtful expression of your brand strategy and values, not just decoration, not arbitrary aesthetic choices. Strategic decisions that reinforce who you are and what you promise. When someone sees your colors, your fonts, and your imagery, they should get an instant impression that aligns with the experience they'll have with your company. Slack's playful color palette and friendly interface match their brand positioning as the tool that makes work more enjoyable. The visuals aren't trying to be serious and corporate because that's not what Slack's brand is about. Whereas something like Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, their visual identity is refined, serious, and traditional because that matches the brand promise of stability and established expertise. Section 9, the real guideline. So what should the guideline actually be? Not our brand is specific colors and fonts. Instead, our brand is communicated through consistent visual identity that expresses our core values, positioning, personality, and promise. Or, more simply, our visual identity is how we show people who we are, but we need to know who we are first. If you're in leadership, here's your checklist. Do we have a clear brand strategy and positioning? Can everyone in the company articulate what makes us different? And is it actually true? Do we have defined values that actually influence decisions, not just words on a wall? Do we actually live by them? Do we live by the examples instead of just saying things that we want to be true? Do we have a documented brand voice and personality? Do all our communications feel like they come from the same company? Do we deliver a consistent experience across all customer touchpoints? Do we say we care about the customer, but the complaints on the Better Business Bureau website says differently? And then, yes, do we have consistent visual identity that expresses all the above? If you've got the first ones down, but not the last ones, you need to fix the last ones. Visual inconsistency is confusing and unprofessional. But if you've got the last ones without fixing the first ones, you've got the appearance of a brand without the substance. And that's worse because you think you're done when you've barely started. Section 10, practical takeaways. Here's how to actually implement this. Create comprehensive brand guidelines, not just visual guidelines. Document your voice, your values, your positioning, your customer experience principles alongside your logo usage and color codes. Train your team on brand, not just the design. Make sure everyone understands not just what colors to use, but what we stand for and how we communicate it. Equip people to adapt, not just to execute. Your brand should be flexible enough that someone can actually create something that fits the context while still feeling on brand, even if it doesn't look identical to everything else. Measure brand performance beyond the visual compliance. Are customers associating you with your intended positioning? Is your NPS score reflecting your brand promise? Is your team living your values? And maybe most important, fix brand problems at the right level. If customers don't trust you, that's not a logo problem. If your value proposition is unclear, that's not a color palette problem. If your legal teams are constantly fighting lawsuits, that's not a typography problem. Visual identity is powerful, but it's the clothes your brand wears, not the person underneath. So the next time someone says, our brand is our colors and our fonts, they're not completely wrong. Visual identity does matter, but push deeper. Ask, what do those colors represent? What personality do those fonts express? What promise are we making that these visuals support? Because the strongest brands aren't the ones with the prettiest style guidelines. They're the ones where everything, visual identity, voice, experience, values, positioning, all align to tell the same story. And that's when visual identity becomes powerful, not as the brand itself, but as the perfect expression of it. And that's the difference between companies that have a logo and companies that have a brand.